The problem is that we're not trained in its use. And just like any other part of our body, like let's say our tongue and our stomach, if we are not trained in controlling our desire for like processed food, calorie-dense food, fats and sugars kind of mixed together, if we lose control of that, that will hurt us.
People seem to be addicted to overstimulation, whether we're talking social media, porn, alcohol, and the like. People have this unyielding codependency with overstimulation. And from the vantage point of psychiatry, neuroscience, the brain, what is this doing to us, to our brains, to our mental health, et cetera? I feel like that's a pretty good place to start, especially given your expertise.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the short answer is it ain't good. And depending on what you're talking about, so if we're talking about porn versus social media, there are actually discrete effects on the brain.
Interesting.
So I think part of the challenge is that it's not all homogenous. But I think the most high level thing that's going on is kind of a vicious cycle where human beings used to like process and sit with their emotions. So if you kind of think about the way that our brains evolved, we would like, let's say, go out hunting. And so we'd track a deer for like, let's say 2 hours. And then we hunt the deer, we're successful. Let's say you shoot an arrow, you hit it, I shoot an arrow, I miss, I feel bad about myself. And then what happens is I have 2 hours of basically idle time, like mentally, to process that kind of stuff. The biggest thing that I'm seeing in our society today is that we don't have like time to decompress. So if you literally look at the cognitive experience that human beings evolved in, it was like plenty of time, right? We're doing rote tasks. We're out there like foraging, hunting, whatever. And our mind is like kind of empty and can process everything that's going on. Whereas right now, what we're really getting is so much stimulation that we don't have time to process our events. And not only that, but if something bad happens to you, not only do you not have time to process it, you actually actively move away from it. So if I get yelled at work and I go home, if I'm like sitting on the train, what am I going to be doing? Am I going to be thinking about it? Quite the opposite. I don't want to think about it because it's painful to think about. And now I have access to so many distracting things that we are literally moving away from ourselves. So that's kind of the biggest thing that's going on, just societally.
Wow. So social media, in a way, our technology is subverting our ability to process essentially all of the many things that we endure as humans on a day-to-day basis, the ups, the downs. It's basically we're deflecting, and it's impairing our ability to adequately process what it is that we're all collectively and individually going through.
Absolutely. And not only is it like deflecting our ability to process, it's actually, we're sort of outsourcing our emotional regulation, which is creating its own set of problems. So now if I don't feel good about the way that I look, I will log on to social media and then I will feel worse about myself. And then beautifully, there will be advertisements and other things like that that will tell me, hey, if I buy this thing, I will feel good about myself. So, you can wear this particular thing, or you can start using this eye cream, or you can purchase something. And if you purchase the right thing, then you'll feel better about yourself. You'll build confidence, all this kind of stuff. So we're kind of like outsourcing our emotional regulation to them. And then they're also giving us solutions, which we love.
Yeah. I mean, whenever I have these conversations, I feel like it becomes very easy for me to get really pessimistic and nihilistic and have this like dystopian sense about the world, because it doesn't seem like things are getting better. It feels like things are getting worse. So how do we get ahead of this problem and ultimately solve it for ourselves? Because I mean, like, mental health statistics are really abysmal these days, like really, really heartbreaking. And I'm sure you can speak to this better than anybody. But I mean, is it right to feel that way? Do you see signs of hope?
Yeah. So I think it's completely normal to feel that way. So I think I'm seeing the highest level of like existential depression I've ever seen in my practice.
Wow.
So there used to be an assumption in the world that like the world would be okay. Like individuals were having problems within the world, but the world wasn't screwed. And if I can figure out how to successfully interact with a stable, persistent, safe world, then I would be okay. The problem right now that we're seeing in mental health is that the problem actually isn't in me. The problem is out there. And if the problem is out there, I can't fix it. And so when we're faced with unsolvable problems, it is very natural to feel very hopeless. I do think, however, that we're not screwed, because I think what's essentially happened is that technology has gotten away from us. So unlike other industries, where if you kind of look at, let's say, the development of nuclear energy, the development of nuclear energy was like driven by a controlling force and developed over, many years. And what's happened, like, the smartphone is like basically 20 years old. Like, that's it. And it went from being a brand new product to everyone on the planet, like literally owning one. So technology has just grown so rapidly that and what sort of happens, it's almost like when you introduce a new organism into an ecosystem that has no natural predators, the organism spreads and becomes very invasive very quickly. And then over time, the ecosystem will adapt. And I think that's what we're seeing, that technology is infused every corners of our life. There are some people who understand technology very, very well that are not necessarily using it for the benefit of humanity. I think a lot of people are. I don't think that corporations are like evil or anything like that. But I think that if you look at, for example, all the big media giants, right? So like if we look at Google and Amazon and Meta and things like that, they're all competing for our attention because that's how their platforms work. Like, that's normal, right? So they're trying to increase user engagement. But if YouTube steals an hour of my attention from Facebook, the one person who absolutely loses is me. Right? Because I'm losing 1 hour no matter which platform I'm using. And so the more and more sophisticated these platforms become, the more of my time I end up losing. And kind of going back to the nihilism, I realize that's kind of sad. But I think the big thing is that we haven't started leveraging these platforms for good. And quite it's starting to happen. So even when we look at this podcast, so here's a problem. And now, like, random people on the internet can hear a conversation between the two of us, and they can potentially get some kind of improvement. So that's what we do at Healthy Gamer as well, is we're leveraging the platform to have conversations that reach millions of people. And that's like working pretty well. So technology is not good or bad. It's just we've let it run out of control, and we haven't started using it really for good and in quite as profound a way as we can.
Yeah, it's like fire. Fire can either burn you or cook your food, right? It's a double-edged sword, and there are many, many instances of that. Tell me about your background, because you yourself, at one point were addicted to gaming, were you not?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I grew up playing a lot of video games. And then I think around high school is when it started to become a problem. I was like a pretty smart kid, so I never really had to study much. So built up a lot of bad habits and was also bullied some. And so like video games were fantastic because they were always challenging. I didn't have to socialize with people. I didn't get made fun of when I played them. I got made fun of at school the next day, but at least I had some time, some kind of escape. So I was very addicted to video games, and then failed out of basically 2 years of college. And had no idea what was going on. Like, my parents had no idea. They tried tough love. They tried kind love. They tried help. They tried discipline. They tried all kinds of stuff, like sent me to a military school, and like nothing seemed to work.
That's fascinating. And you ended up becoming a Harvard trained physician, which is no small feat. So, and now at this point you've established Healthy Gamer, which is a platform where you talk about all these kinds of issues, mental health issues, and you've become like this social media phenom, which I think is super interesting. But to elaborate, if you can, on your journey, because I think it's something that, is probably going to be very inspiring to people. I mean, it's sort of like you took this incredible challenge that you were facing in your personal life, and you turned it into something really remarkable.
Yeah. So I'm happy to share, and hopefully it inspires people. Hopefully it reassures people is what I'm really shooting for. So I think after I, almost failed out of college. So I was on academic probation, and I'd failed too many classes, was on the verge of getting kicked out. My dad was basically like, look, I don't know what to do with you. You've got to go to India. And I was like, what do you want me to do there? And he's like, I don't really know. There's an ashram, which is like a monastery, and I think you should go there for some time. And it was a little bit clear. We booked a one-way ticket. And I went to this monastery, and I really discovered something. So the first 2 weeks were terrible. Like, I was crying every day. I would like pick up the phone, and they had phone booths. So this was like India, rural India. And I remember like wanting to call my parents every single day and ask them to like get me a ticket because I wanted to come home. And so I would pick up the phone and then they ask me, how am I doing? And instead of saying terrible, I would say, I'm doing okay. And I kind of said to myself, like, I'm just going to give it one more day. Like I can always get a ticket back tomorrow. And after I was there for about 2 weeks, then I started actually like paying attention to what was happening. And I thought it was super cool. And the biggest thing that I realized was that we teach all kinds of stuff. We teach mathematics. We teach, biology. You teach a lot about healthy food and what we should be eating and stuff like that. But we don't teach people how they work. And no one had ever explained to me, and it was so frustrating, why it is that I would wake up one day and go to Spanish class and sleep through Spanish class the next day. Like I just could not understand why I could not control myself. My desires were out of control. Everything was just out of control. I didn't know how to live my life. And what I really discovered in India was a methodology for like how a human being works. And I fell in love with it. Decided I wanted to become a monk. So tried to take my vows about 3 months in. And my teachers were brilliant. And they were like, yeah, we're not going to do that. So you need to go back to the United States. You need to finish your school. You need to get a doctoral degree of some kind. And after you turn 30, if you're still interested, we'll take you. You can still come back and we'll teach you stuff, but we're not going to let you renounce your life. And one of my teachers was like, I'm ready to give up my life. And he was like, Alok, what are you giving up? You have nothing to give up. And he's like, you're a failure. There's nothing, can't give anything up. You don't have anything. So it's like, go and get stuff. And then if you want to give it up, then you can give it up. So I went back, finished college, ultimately met the woman who would become my wife, decided that I wanted to learn about this stuff, was really curious about the science behind what I was learning in terms of like meditation and things like that. So ended up doing research at Harvard, at the medical school. And so decided to go to medical school, had some awesome mentors there, went to med school, was going to do like integrative oncology and help people like, with cancer and stuff like that, be a real doctor. But then realized that what I really loved, my favorite organ was the mind. So I ended up focusing on psychiatry. And really thought that we have a lot to learn about the way that our mind works, and then ended up, matching at Mass General Hospital and McLean Hospital, which are Harvard Medical School teaching affiliates, and trained there. And then while I was there, I started asking my mentors about video game addiction. And that's when I kind of realized like this is back in 2015, like people didn't really know anything about it. They're like, yeah, it's kind of there. There's some debate. One of my psychoanalytic supervisors, a psychoanalyst who had a very successful career, was like, yeah, I think the reason people get video games is the same reason they get tattoos. And I was like, what? And there was this like, psychoanalytic interpretation of subconscious, whatever. And so really noticed that our existing institutions were not good enough. Like technology was evolving so rapidly. People are using it so much. And if you look at like how long it takes from applying for a grant, getting funded, doing a study, takes like 5-6 years for the results to be published. We need to do 20 of those before we make a decision about something. Once we decide after 10 to 15 years, then it becomes a part of the curriculum, and then we start training people in it. But there's still studies being published on, not even Meta, on Facebook, like studies that got started in 2018 or whatever, or 2008 even. And so the pace of technological advancement was too fast. And so I tried to figure out, okay, what can we do about this? Yeah. And even my mentors were kind of like, okay, here's your 10-year plan or 15-year plan to become the world's expert in video game addiction. I was like, that's too long. Like people, what's happening to all the people who are failing out of college now? That's how we started Healthy Gamer.
Amazing. You mentioned at the top that a lot of these addictions seem to be neurobiologically distinct, right? But like when I was writing my second book, I found a lot of similarities between porn addiction, which is a relatively new phenomena, I think, and the somewhat more conserved phanomena of junk food addiction. There's similarity, right? Like in the same way that ultra processed, refined, packaged processed, shelf-stable foods have this quality of being hyper palatable, and the capacity that they have to push your brain to a bliss point beyond which like self-control is seemingly impossible. With porn, there seems to be the same thing on the internet, where the porn just gets more and more hyper palatable, for lack of a better term. I mean, it gets more extreme, more easily accessible. It's very similar to our, in the predisposed person that might potentially become addicted to porn. Very similar to how I think a lot of people today in the Western world experience these ultra processed foods, and which is why we see staggering rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes. So would you say that are there similarities that we might draw from one arena to apply to another?
Absolutely. So I think that let's remember that all addictions are going to share some commonality, right? So just the process of addiction. And the two things that all addictions share is they give us pleasure and they take away pain. So anything that does those two things but makes you worse afterward is the foundation of addiction. And it's interesting that you mentioned binge eating and porn, because I do think that those two are, interestingly enough, quite similar. Like they're closer on the neurobiology side. So the first thing that's very common with both of them is this idea of a supernormal stimulus. So we all have certain things that our brain interprets as good. So for example, like easily accessible carbohydrates or things that are fats, or especially carbs and fats combined together, led to a high degree of survival in our species. So this is a normal signal which our brain has interpreted as healthy. And then what people figured out is if we can jack up that signal, it will result in an addiction. And the same thing happens with pornography. So what we see in pornography is supernormal stimuli. So at the beginning, it was like erotic fiction in the 1700s, right? That's like a normal stimulus. And then we started creating maybe like pictures or photographs, and then we had color photographs. And then we had motion, and then we had color motion. And now we've got high def, and we've got sound, and we've got virtual reality. And even if you look at the way that in pornography producers are sort of figuring this out in almost like an evolutionary sense, they're figuring out that when I wear lots of contrasting colors, or stuff is extra loud, or stuff is extra bouncy, these are the stimuli that our brain like. And as we jack up those stimuli, we're increasing the level of like addiction that we feel. So what you'll see is, especially in pornography, this like kind of progression that the same stuff doesn't do it for you, and you require more and more hardcore pornography for some people.
Yeah.
And so it's that same idea of supernormal stimulus. And on the food side, what we're seeing is like, okay, we're going to create some new version of high fructose corn syrup, or we're going to genetically modify like our gluten sequencing in a way that makes it feel more satisfying. So we're seeing this kind of like further and further adaptation of this kind of this thing that we think is healthy, and they jack it way up. And then it induces this biological response. So that's the other big thing, is if we look at, pornography and orgasm creates an autonomic flood, and food does the same thing. So the reason that they're so addictive is because they work on the body in the way that, let's say, social media addiction won't. You may get dopamine, but you're not going to get like parasympathetic nervous system, endogenous endorphins, insulin release. So they're whole body addictions, which a lot of people don't realize.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I feel like there is a degree to which social media kind of mimics this as well. Like when you look at TikTok, for example, compared to Instagram, right? TikTok is like a whole, and I'm not like a regular TikTok user or anything, but what I've been able to glean from my dalliances with the app is that it takes like the Instagram Explore page and it just like jacks up the addictive capacity of it by making it faster, shorter, quicker, more, I guess, like bouncy in a way. Like, the kind of content that tends to surface on TikTok is like, I don't know. I mean, for lack of a better term, it tends to be bouncier, right? There's like actual bouncing. So I feel like, yeah, you're right. Like it's taking these concepts. It's almost like as if these Silicon Valley geniuses they have some kind of crazy insight. They must have some kind of crazy insight to the human brain. Like I feel like psychiatrists couldn't design these apps to be more addicting.
Yeah. So I think they have an insight into the brain, but it's from a different perspective. So what we do in psychiatry is we try to understand the brain first and then engineer what works. and I don't think it's just Silicon Valley, because I think TikTok is developed in China, but it's all over the world. What these people do is they do it the other way. They run so many different experiments, A/B tests, things like that. I don't think they understand the psychological principles. They just figure out what works. And even if you look at the way that like Instagram Reels is moving or YouTube Shorts is moving or things like that, everyone is just testing out so many things, because we're kind of operating on a global big data scale, that you can run so many tests that you can just figure out what works. And paradoxically, like I do some consulting for companies, like we've worked with companies like Meta and gaming companies and stuff like that. I don't think they're all evil. And the good news is that oftentimes when I teach them about psychological or psychiatric principles, it like leads to positive change. So for example, I was working with a video game company and they were interested in making more positive communities. And so what I was teaching them is that, okay, like you guys, if someone does something toxic in a game, they get reported, and then 3 weeks later, some kind of action happens. So, and it doesn't make any change because there's no Pavlovian conditioning. The response is so far from the stimulus that it doesn't change behavior. So oftentimes what I find is with these gaming companies and even these big tech companies is they're actually missing a lot of like psychological basics, but they're just really, really good at figuring out what works, but they don't necessarily understand why it works.
What is it about gaming specifically that appealed to you?
I think a couple of different things. One is it's one place that I could compete. So I was a year younger than most of my colleagues, and I grew up thinking I'm just like not good at sports. It's only years later that I realized that I was like a 5-year-old, sometimes competing against 7-year-olds. And so like you're gonna suck. Right? Like if you're playing basketball against a 7-year-old and you're 5. And so some of it was, but on a video game, like I could compete. Right. So that was a big part of it. I think I was also bored at school, and video games are delightfully addictive because they're perfectly paced to you. So if I like lose on level 1, I get to try again. And the moment that I beat level 2, level 2 is waiting for me. And I remember being at school and kind of finishing a math worksheet and walking up to my teacher and I said, "Can I have the next one?" And she was like, "What do you mean the next one? This is the only thing we're doing today." And then I would sit in school and like wait for 45 minutes while everyone else like worked on the worksheet. And so I think a lot of smart kids are more likely to get addicted to video games because they get bored with school. And here's something that's intellectually engaging.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I became addicted to, I don't know. Addicted is probably a strong word, but I definitely derived more joy and I felt more comfortable engaging with technology than I did my high school social life or lack thereof.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's huge too, that games, especially nowadays, offer us like a community, right? And the real world is a scary place, but it's like really nice when if I don't like something that someone does, I can just block them and I can add someone else and I can join a new Discord server. I can get banned over here. I can go over there. So there's sort of an infinite number of possibilities, and it's very easy to retreat from social interactions you don't like online. It's a very dangerous combination.
Yeah. How do you balance? Because I mean, you do all this amazing stuff on Twitch, on YouTube. Do you have clinical like hours? Like, do you see patients?
Yeah, I still see a handful of patients. These are generally speaking like historical patients. So, when I was a full-time practicing clinician, I had some patients that I've been working with them for a while, and I just continue to do so because they don't want someone else, and we've done good work. So I do some clinical practice every week, but most of my time is actually spent on Healthy Gamer. And that involves everything from like teaching to YouTube, Twitch, streaming, giving talks, doing some degree of consulting, research. So we're running like 7 studies right now. I think a couple of them are done, but 5 maybe now.
What research areas? Like, what are you most excited about?
So we are studying all kinds of different things. So we have one study going on a questionnaire to assess video game addiction. So one of the problems I think in the field is we think about, so we have questionnaires that measure addiction, but we also know that video games actually have positive effects on mental health. So for example, during the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, gamers were actually the most resilient population against pandemic-related depression. So the rest of the world had to isolate and couldn't meet in person and could no longer go to work and had to spend their whole day on a computer. And it turns out that for us degenerate gamers, that's just life as usual.
Gamers
we know
were chilling.
Yeah, we were fine with that. We were like, hey, we know how to do this. We know how to make friends online. We know how to, have fun online. Like we don't need the outside world. So we know, and I've also worked with gamers, and for every one gamer who is so addicted that they want to kill themselves, I've also met one gamer who the only reason they haven't killed themselves is because of their connections with people online and the games that they play. Like this, and that was true for me too. I mean, there's certainly games that have helped me through dark periods of my life. And so we're developing a questionnaire that measures the positive impacts of video games as well as the negative impacts in terms of addiction. And so, for example, when we design our interventions like our coaching program, we also will look at, okay, can we reduce your unhealthy gaming while maintaining the positive effects of gaming? And that's what we kind of try to measure. And there are even some studies, for example, that show that a small level of alcohol consumption is correlated with positive mental health. That's probably not the alcohol itself, but the associated social activity. But so we know that, some of these substances and technology can have positive effects. So that's one thing that we're doing.
Have you noticed that in your own experience that there seems to be, or at least there in the past seemed to be this really interesting overlap between gamers and the world of bodybuilding? Is that something that ever comes up in your research or in your own personal experience?
What are you, yes, in one really weird way, but I'm curious what you're thinking about.
Well, so when I was first, coming up on the internet in my late teens, as I mentioned, I was really, really interested in technology and computers, borderline probably addicted to the internet at the time. And around that time in my own offline life, I became really interested in fitness and bodybuilding. And I didn't make the connection that there would be any overlap between the two, because at least intuitively, for me, I mean, I would have probably described myself at the time as being a computer nerd, and bodybuilding and fitness is something very much, that has been long associated with, athleticism and jocks. And I was never an athlete. So to me, there was always this disconnect. But then a couple of years ago, I stumbled upon this article. I actually just pulled it up on CNN, and the headline is "Why Gamers Are a Great Fit at the Gym." They've been trained to focus for weeks at a time on a single goal. They know how to clearly identify obstacles and form step-by-step plans to overcome them. They're obsessed with improving specific skills, but judge success only by overall progress made in the world that they've decided to conquer. So it's these traits, according to this article, that actually make video gamers fantastic bodybuilders. And I wonder if you've experienced that. There seems to be this very interesting overlap.
Yeah. So the short answer is yes, and in a couple of different ways. So the first is, I think, to the sadness of many gamers, translating your gaming addiction to the gym is way harder. Right? It's not quite that simple. Most gamers, I don't think, are bodybuilders, but there are absolutely a couple things which I think are at play. The first is that there's this idea that a computer nerd is not athletic. We have in the past thought of these two things as separate, like you're either or, you're a jock or a nerd. But I think that's not true anymore. So you can absolutely be both. And a lot of the workout warriors that I've known in my life are gamers and vice versa. The second thing is that I think oftentimes, if you look at what it takes to succeed in gaming, these are often translatable skills to real life. So just like the article mentions, focus on a particular task, being very metric oriented, right? I want to hit this particular target and hit this particular target and hit this particular target. This is how games addict us. And we can absolutely apply that to I want to be able to bench 210 and then 215 and then 220. So there's absolutely that element. I think the other thing is that oftentimes gamers who view themselves as nerdy decide that I want to be athletic. Like, I'm tired of being in this body, and like I can actually go to the gym and I can start to feel better about myself. So I see that there's a lot of the people I know who are workout warriors are also gamers, but I would not say that most gamers are workout warriors, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, also, and then you have guys like Mark Zuckerberg now regularly promoting this their newfound obsession with martial arts, right? Like in the case of Mark Zuckerberg, jujitsu and the like seems to be, it seems to be this growing kind of phenomena amongst people.
So specifically with martial arts, I think there's an even better overlap. So even in we have a program where we support parents of kids with video game addiction. And one of the key things that we have like a course that teaches them about stuff too. So one of the key things that we emphasize is martial arts, because oftentimes gamers lack confidence, and being able to defend yourself, have a history of bullying. So being able to physically defend yourself, being able to develop confidence. And I think martial arts is also the most spiritual of workout types, right? So there's oftentimes like a spiritual discipline kind of component, which gamers really love. So I think there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of benefit. And I'll routinely recommend that when I'm working with like 15-year-olds or 12-year-olds who are addicted to games, that they seriously consider martial arts. It also, there's a certain badassness to it. So there's an ego gratifying aspect where if you think about like who are the heroes in video games, there are people who are able to beat up bad guys. So I think it's very like comfortable is a goal to aspire to. And then there's also this trope that you start out bad at martial arts, right? So like you start out at a white belt, you start out sucking. And so it feels actually very like ego friendly to be able to go in there because everyone sucks. Whereas when you work out, you go there and you see other people. You're not put into a class with like other noobs, right? You go to the gym and you see other people who are swollen or working out, and you feel embarrassed and you feel different. There's no separation or differentiation. There's no clear idea of like, this is step 1, this is step 2, this is step 3. Whereas in martial arts, you're stuck with a bunch of noobs and then you grow over time. So that makes it kind of ego friendly.
Yeah. And I personally, as somebody who grew up being a gamer of sorts, I actually was never super addicted to gaming per se, but it was more, I was really interested in programming. Like I was an autodidact, and I taught myself how to program in a bunch of different languages when I was way younger. So it wasn't necessarily gaming for me, but I've always really, and I continue to really enjoy activities where the competition is endogenous, where the competition is with myself. I don't like confrontation. I don't like, group sports or anything like that where somebody is better than me, and that makes me really. For me, I prefer when it's just me against myself, and that to me is what made fitness really enticing. And I would imagine also probably is what I'm picking up. A lot of these like martial arts practices have going for them as well.
Yeah, I think that this concept of endogenous competition can be very comforting, right? Because then it doesn't engage the ego. So one of the things that I think this is one of the things that I learned in India is that if we look at the ego has a couple of qualities, and one of them is comparison. So anyone who struggles with comparison has a big ego. Now we think about ego as just in the positive range, like narcissism and like I'm full of myself. But in yoga and in meditation, ego is just the sense of I. So when you think I am ... that's always ego. And so you can even think that you're a terrible person, and then you will still compare yourself a lot. And one of the key functions of ego is comparison. So if people struggle with comparison, and sometimes the reason that we become endogenously competitive is because we don't like comparing ourselves. It hurts to compare. And so even then, if you kind of think about it, like, I think it's totally fine to be, to focus on working out and just measuring against yourself. That's totally, I tend to do that too. I don't like competitive sports, but there's also like a kind of an ego saving thing, because then you're never a loser if you're never competing. And so a key thing there is that if you're someone who's afraid of comparison, if you compare yourself a lot and you're afraid to engage in activities that make you feel bad, interestingly enough, what you really need to work on is your ego. And the more you work on your ego, the easier it will be. You can just go there and recognize that I'm new. So I'm supposed to be bad. And it doesn't have to hurt. It hurts when ego enters the picture.
How do we work on our egos? I mean, you've trained as a monk. So I mean, if anyone's going to be able to solve this for us, it's you, right?
Yeah. So one thing to understand is that the ego is a protective mechanism. So the ego protects you from negative emotions. So anytime you feel negative emotion, the ego will arise. And my favorite example of this is when I was in college. I one time I was like talking with my friends, and we were all like working ourselves up, and I decided I was going to ask out this girl. And then she rejected me, which was usually what happened.
Oh, man.
And then I felt ashamed, right? Because it hurts to be rejected by a girl. And then I noticed that I was making all these statements that didn't make any sense. Like, oh yeah, I wasn't that into her anyway. She's not that attractive. I don't really like her. So I kind of like flex my ego a little bit to protect myself from the shame. Because if I was super into her and I loved her and all this kind of stuff, it would have hurt so much more to be rejected. But I can protect myself by, kind of putting her down. So a lot of like ego is really about protecting us from our negative emotions, but it forces us into some of these illogical mental gymnastics to kind of accomplish that.
But is it helpful? Is that a productive coping strategy?
Well, so it's a great question. So ego, let's remember, isn't a bug, it's a feature. So it's something that everyone has, right? And ego is precisely there to protect you, to give you a sense of identity. So as one good example, like our ego is what protects us from boundary violations. So if someone steals from you, you say, that's mine. You are not allowed to do this to me. So from an evolutionary standpoint, it's absolutely useful. The problem is that we're not trained in its use. And just like any other part of our body, like let's say our tongue and our stomach, if we are not trained in controlling our desire for like processed food, calorie dense food, fats and sugars kind of mixed together, if we lose control of that, that will hurt us. So the problem with ego is it's not that it's harmful. It's that when we lose control of it and it's running the show, right? Because it's hard to say, I really did care about that person. I was hoping that she would say yes, but I can learn from this experience and move on. That's such a positive way to think about it. That's not what we do, right? We start devaluing the other person. So an ego out of control is what's dangerous.
How do we get it under control, though? We also, I feel like we also live in a time that uniquely places the focus on our egos and the more superficial aspects of our being. Whether it's social media. Social media is probably, to be honest, the biggest one, right? Everybody's lives are on display 24/7, but they're not authentic portraits of our lives. They're these hyper curated, hyper stylized, filtered, processed versions, just like the food that we're all overindulging on.
Absolutely. And it's a great insight, Max, because you're spot on. So we live in a society that activates our ego. So we live in a society where we are constantly judged, where we craft a version of ourselves for consumption by other people, right? And so we're seeing, we do a lot of work with like content creators, for example. We work with about 500 content creators, and all of their egos are through the roof. I don't mean like narcissistically. I mean that they're experiencing a lot of negative emotion, and they have to sort of develop a sense of identity to kind of protect themselves from that. So we absolutely live in a day and age where it's not just about social media. It's also about things like if you look at job applications or dating, right? These are situations where we get rejected hundreds of times. So with like online job applications, you have to send out 1,000 and you're going to get rejected from 999. With dating apps, you're going to get rejected thousands, tens of thousands, or even on the top end, hundreds of thousands of times. And human brains were not designed for that magnitude of rejection. So it's absolutely problematic and way worse in today's society. So how to get control of it, I think was your question, right? So there are a couple of things that we can do, a couple of basic things. So the first is we have to understand that ego activates to protect us from negative emotion. So the more negative emotion we experience, the more that the bouncer has to step in and protect you. This is part of the reason why people find practices like psychotherapy or like some kind of emotional wellness practice so helpful. Because if you sort of think about, if you have if the ego doesn't have to protect you from anything, so if you can kind of metabolize that fear, work through that anxiety, really sort of heal that shame or that trauma, the ego doesn't need to function anymore. And that's also what we do in psychotherapy when we're working with people who are like narcissistic, right? So the way that you disarm the narcissistic defense mechanism is you help the patient feel safe. And once they feel safe, they don't need to defend themselves. And so then you don't need the narcissism. So metabolizing the underlying emotion is one way to just completely disarm the ego. The second thing that you can do is to recognize the activity of ego in the moment. So remember that the problem here isn't that we have an ego. We don't necessarily need to dissolve it. We just need to stop being controlled by it. And the simplest way to stop being controlled by any part of your being is to become aware of it, right? As long as things are unconscious, you will think that it's destiny or it's fate or you're a victim because you don't realize your hand in this thing. So there are two main things that we sort of teach people to focus on when they're trying to detect their ego. Anytime that I'm pumping myself up or knocking someone down. So if I'm insulting someone, devaluing them, or I'm saying to myself, I'm the best, that's a function of the ego. It's literally the part of the mind that does that. And the second thing is any comparison. So if you sort of think about the fundamentals of comparison, in order to make a comparison, I have to rate you in a particular way, and I have to rate me in a particular. That's the only way I can make a comparison, right? So that involves a judgment about myself. I'm better looking, I'm worse looking, I'm smarter, I'm stupider, I'm healthier, I'm more unhealthy. All of those are egotistical statements. So if you notice that your mind is making comparisons, which a lot of your listeners will probably notice they're making all the time. So a good example, once again, is social media. When you're on social media, what are you doing? You're constantly comparing yourself to the things that you're looking at, right? That's why we're increasing the activity of the ego. So just catching it in the act will start to create control over it. And that's just literally how the neuroscience of it works. Awareness and control of any faculty of your body go hand in hand. And a good example of that is if you've had dental work done and you get numb, you can't control anything in your mouth because you can't feel it and you're not aware of it. Like that's literally the point. And so awareness and control go hand in hand. And the third thing is there's a set of like meditation practices. So I like these practices called Shunya meditations, which we'll teach. And Shunya means void or null or zero. And so there are these practices that you can do to connect with essentially like the emptiness within you. And that emptiness is really the truest sense of what you are. And then it kind of like dissolves the ego as you do those sorts of practices.
Wow. Could you walk us through what that practice looks like?
Well, there are different kinds, but so I think here's a good example of one that we'll use that's a little bit more functional. So if I ask you, Max, who are you? Right. So how would you answer that question?
I'm a guy, curious guy.
Okay.
Who is very creative and likes to create content and help people. Beautiful.
Okay. How do you know you're a guy?
I looked in the mirror this morning.
And what did you see?
I saw a dude with facial hair and
does facial hair make you a guy?
I guess not. Well, it's just, I feel like I know who I am, and I've always been, I have the machinery of, so to speak, of guyhood.
Right.
And,
so let's say you have an accident, heaven forbid.
Yeah.
And you lose your machinery.
Yeah.
Right? Or we have patients that I've seen that will have cancer in their genital region and that needs to be surgically removed. Are they still guys?
Yeah, they are.
How?
Well, there's an innate sense of who.
Now we're getting somewhere. So what, like literally, if you close your eyes, what do you feel innately about your being? Let's say that you exist. Let's say that for the lifespan of your existence, you just existed for the next 60 seconds. What would you learn about who you are? Right. So there's no like close your eyes and just what do you know about who you are? You just exist. You can feel your body, but guy is a construction.
Fair.
Right. And so this is the really interesting thing. This is the wild thing is if you think about your life is literally constructed of individual moments. That's all it is. That's literally all that exists, right? You're in this moment. That's all there is. And from this moment, you cannot engineer any aspect of your ego. If all you have is this moment, you can't get it. So if I say to myself, I'm a doctor, right? I'm a doctor now. So if I close my eyes and I exist for 60 seconds, how do I know I'm a doctor? Is it a certain amount of knowledge? Well, what if I get my license taken away? Right? Or what if I teach my children everything that I know about medicine, but they never get a medical degree? Are they still a doctor? Was I a doctor before I got the MD? Or the second that they handed me a piece of paper, suddenly I became a doctor, because this is what that means. So for me, I became a doctor about 1 year into my residency training, like at the end of internship. I was like, holy crap, now I'm a doctor and I know what that means. But if you really stop and think about it, what the Shunya meditation practices are is if you close your eyes and you just notice what you are in this moment, that your experience of the present moment can never create your sense of identity. I'm a loser. Close your eyes for a second and show me where the loser is. Tell me what I need to biopsy, what I need to dissect to find the loserness. It's a mental construction. Ego is a mental construction, right? And so these practices are really about sort of noticing, and what I'll sort of tell people to do, really simple practices. If you kind of close your eyes, you'll notice that from a physical standpoint, you have an absence of feeling somewhere around here. So you can feel your periphery, you can feel your abdomen, you can even feel your chest, you can feel your breath, but like there's kind of like this emptiness kind of in there. And you can even just sit with that emptiness. And whatever sort of negativity you have, whatever thoughts about your identity that you have, you can kind of put them in there. And that's like an example of kind of a crash course Shunya practice.
Fascinating. Is the goal of the practice to fill the emptiness?
Nope. Can't fill the emptiness. Emptiness is infinite.
Is it just like innate to the human condition?
Yes. According to the yogis in like, India and China and whatnot. So they think that if you really look at the fundamental quality of what it means to be human. So if we sort of ask you, how do you know you're Max? What is Max? Well, Max used to be 1 year old and now you're not 1 year old, but you're still Max. Max is a man, but maybe something can happen. Let's hope not, to some parts that make you a man.
God forbid.
Right? And you'd still be Max.
Yeah.
You were Max before you were a content creator. You were a Max before you enjoyed helping people. You've always been you, right? That's the one thing. The attributes change. The facial hair changes, the hair changes, everything changes. But the one thing that is core is your capacity to experience your life. The content of life can fluctuate. The content of your identity can fluctuate. But the one thing that is fixed to you is you are the one who constantly experiences all the things that Max lives through. I'm not experiencing it. Someone else isn't experiencing it. And you're not experiencing what I'm living, right? So that fundamental quality of experience is the truest form of self. And so the best example I can give you is if you imagine, like, let's say people are looking at a monitor right now, right? So there's a picture of the two of us, but we don't exist on the monitor. It's just an image on the monitor. So what is the monitor? That's really who we are. We are the capacity for experience. And as we go through life, different stuff gets displayed on the monitor, but it doesn't change the fact that the monitor is not, there isn't really a cat there. We're not really there. It's just a visual representation. And so in that way, I know it's kind of weird, but all of your life is experienced through you. And the more that you sit with that fundamental quality of experience without an object, the closer to your true self you'll become. And this is why we meditate with our eyes closed, right? So if you meditate, you try to get away from all of the objects and you just sit with yourself. And then you can enter the state of mind where you're not seeing anything, you're not hearing anything, you're not even thinking anything. You're just existing, your awareness without an object or a focus.
Wow. That's what some people, I think, refer to as their soul, right? But I kind of think of it as like, I've always thought about it as the narrative of self, the story that's continually being written moment to moment that in summation add up to who a person is.
Yeah, so I think that's a beautiful take on it, right? But the key thing to remember there is the moment that we make it a narrative, we're moving beyond one point in time. You're stringing multiple points of time together, which is going to give you a sense of self. Like, that's not bad. That's also a feature. So, and you're spot on. But if you kind of think about it, you can have a narrative of self, but any slice of that, you won't find that narrative of self, any individual slice. So then the question is, so then it becomes an abstraction. The moment that, you start adding it all together, it starts to become different from the individual pieces.
Because you went through the process of becoming a monk.
Yeah.
Did you go? Did you fully? Were you anointed into
Nope.
the monkhood?
Yeah. So got rejected. They said, come back when you're 30.
Come back when you're 30.
And so I went through all of the training, and then my teachers were wise and realized that I was escaping life. Right.
Wow.
So that was also about ego, by the way. So it was like, I suck at life. So instead I'm going to forsake life, and I'm going to be superior to everyone who's trying to live these materialistic lives. I'm going to become spiritual and better than them.
That's a pretty cool thing, though, to have inform a medical practice.
Absolutely. So one of the weirdest things for me in med school, and especially in residency, is you get taught all this stuff about the mind, right? As if it's true. So you learn like Freud's theories, and this is how the mind works. And the whole time I was like, wait, that's not the only way you can conceptualize it. There's a whole different system of the mind, which we don't understand very well in the West. So there's like an alternate way of looking at things, which we're starting to see, by the way, in the sort of the newest wave of psychotherapy. So if you look at dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, we're starting to recognize that these Eastern conceptions of the mind have therapeutic value.
Wow. So interesting. So then when it comes to battling addictions, whether again to ultra processed foods, pornography, which a lot of men unfortunately are suffering from today, gambling, alcohol, you name it. Would you say the first step is really to try to cultivate an awareness around such addictions?
Absolutely. I don't know if I would call it the first step, but it's probably one of the most important steps. So there are a handful of neuroscientific deficits in the brain when someone has an addiction. Doesn't matter what the addiction is. These are the common deficits for all addictions. And one of them is a lack of awareness. So in my clinical work as an addiction psychiatrist, I'd talk to patients and I'd say, well, like, what happened after relapse? And they said, I don't know, doc. For the first 3 months, I was doing fine. And then I don't know what happened. Something just slipped up. That's not usually how it works. What usually happens is that there's some kind of psychological need or stress building up that they're blind to. And once it tips over a particular point, that's when they end up reaching for the substance. So a lack of internal awareness is literally correlated with your vulnerability to addiction.
Wow. So how can we then cultivate greater self-awareness? I mean, I know people offline in my real life that aren't necessarily addicts, but don't seem to have any particularly significant sense of self-awareness, at least from my vantage point. They're people who you would not necessarily describe as being very self-aware. I, on the other hand, I'm a very self-aware person. I'm constantly introspecting, running inventory of how I feel, my mood, my emotional status. And so I'm a really self-aware person, but I feel like many people aren't today.
Yeah. So there's a simple reason why it's hard to be self-aware right now. And that's because the society makes it hard. So if you look at our society today, we literally have a lot of externalizing influences for our attention. So if you literally look at something like a cell phone, right? A cell phone is designed to constantly pull your attention away from yourself. So it'll ping you with a notification. There's some kind of icon. There's kind of some flashy thing, right? So we have constantly externalizing awareness pressures. We're constantly getting phone calls. We're getting messages. We get emails at all hours of the day. Work constantly needs this. We have kids who are constantly pulling our attention. It doesn't matter what world you live in. Something is going to be pulling your attention outside of you. And if we go back, let's say 5,000 years, 6,000 years in a hunter-gatherer society, we go hunting for a couple hours and we're walking back and we're spending a lot of time with ourselves. So I think the reason that people are becoming less self-aware is because our attention is being pulled outside of ourselves. And then we get into this vicious cycle because once I stop paying attention to myself, things can get out of control, right? So I'm not keeping inventory. I'm not cleaning house internally. We also have a lot of technology that regulates our emotions for us. So binge watching stuff or video games or pornography, they all reduce the activity of our amygdala and limbic system, which means they shut off our negative emotions. And so if we're using these technologies to shut off our negative emotions, if we stop using them, what happens? The emotions come roaring back. Now we're no longer suppressing the amygdala, the anxiety returns. And then once I feel anxious on the inside, what do I want to do? I don't want to spend time in here In fact, I'm trying to get away from what's going on in here. I'm depressed. I'm anxious. Turns out pornography exists and I can watch some pornography and that'll shut off those negative feelings. And so you're absolutely right that like people are becoming less self-aware. And that's because being self-aware is painful. At least until we learn how to manage it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely it can be a double-edged sword, and there's definitely a cost, I think, associated with too much self-awareness. It probably correlates with increased neuroticism, anxiety, things like that. If I had to guess, I mean, I'm occasionally prone to anxiety, neuroticism in certain regards.
Yeah. So, I mean, even the way that you talk, right? You're taking inventory constantly, et cetera. That sounds like pretty neurotic, like in the sense that you're always paying attention, right? You're very sensitive to internal stimuli. It's not a bad thing.
I'm a Jew from New York. I mean, it's like,
so it's cultural.
Yeah. It's cultural. It's just like comes with the territory.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things to understand. Awareness is not necessarily thought, right? So if you kind of think about it, what the real kind of Eastern awareness is the capacity to observe. So a lot of times, and you're kind of spot on, that sometimes what happens is if we introspect too much, what we can do is get caught up in our mind. So if you look at something like a panic attack or a thought loop, this is when the mind dominates your experience, your internal experience of self. You actually don't see it anymore. You're not an external observer. You don't think to myself, my mind is out of control. You think to yourself, I am out of control. So a lot of that introspection we have to be careful about, because we're not just talking about the mind. We're actually talking about the experience which kind of exists outside of mind. And when we get caught up in our mind, I know it's kind of esoteric, when our mind sort of dominates our thoughts and we no longer have distance from it, is when introspection becomes a problem. Kind of like a good example of this is if you go through a breakup and then you start thinking to yourself, like your mind is full of these thoughts and you lose control of your mind. You're not observing your mind. You kind of say like, oh my God, I'm screwed. This is over. I'll be alone for the rest of my life. And then if you kind of, what will your friends tell you? They'll say, take a step back. Look at the big picture. So that is actually literally moving away from your mind and settling yourself in that observer, which is that capacity for experience. That's really what awareness is.
Amazing. And that's also where I feel like the value of psychedelics, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy comes into play, correct? Because I feel like, if I recall correctly, when I was reading those Roland Griffith studies, rest in peace, Roland Griffith, he just passed away due to terminal cancer. But the magnitude of the effect was related to how much a person was able to experience a sense of meta awareness about their situation, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's crazy that you know that stuff. Like, I'm super impressed, Max. I know you're super into science but that's some very, yeah. So let's understand something about the mechanism of psychedelics. So if we want to kind of take a big picture of this, let's look at something like the clinical treatment of depression. So when you look at the mind of a depressed person, what you actually find is that they are very involved in their thoughts, and their thoughts are really reflected on themselves. So what I'll think if I'm suicidal is something like, my family would be better off without me. But I'm sort of still thinking about, if I'm no longer there, I'm thinking about me. I'm hurting these people. I'm hurting these people. These people are better off without me. I'm a terrible person. I suck at everything. So it's still me in a weird way. So what we sort of know is that in the mind of a depressed person, they have this part of their brain called the default mode network. And the default mode network is what gives us an awareness of ourselves. The default mode network is actually hyperactive in depression. So if we look at some of these novel treatments of depression, the fastest acting treatment for depression that we have is ketamine. And ketamine works almost instantly. And the reason it works almost instantly is because it's a dissociative agent, and it actually shuts off the default mode network.
Wow.
Meditation also shuts off the default mode network. And psychedelics also shut off the default mode network. So when you have people taking psychedelics, they have an awareness of self that transcends the bounds of them. So they start feeling connected to other people. So the barrier between them and others actually starts to break down. And if you look at the therapeutic value of psychedelics, and this is why I don't advocate that people use them, because it's not the psychedelic itself that actually leads to the healing. The precise studies that I think you cited show that it is the dissolution of self. So sometimes people will just like hallucinate and stuff like that. That doesn't actually lead to healing. What seems to the biggest factor that appears to lead to healing is this loss of sense of self and this gain of meta awareness, which is shutting off the default mode network. And then the other key thing about healing of psychedelics is that we know that when it's done within bounds, it's not the psychedelic itself. It's that when you contextualize that experience, either through a spiritual tradition or psychotherapy, that's when it leads to good clinical outcomes. But you're spot on that it's dissolving of the self that is very important, which is what the meta-awareness is.
It's so cool. Are you familiar at all with Dacher Keltner's work? He's a Stanford scientist who wrote a book recently on awe. He's dedicated his career to studying awe and wonder. And one of the great, and there's all these interesting links. Like the more a person experiences awe and wonder, they seem to have lower levels of inflammation. They seem to have more positive health outcomes. But it's interesting because awe and wonder is a emotional state that is kind of similar, right? Like when you're staring at a vast landscape or up at the stars, it makes you feel small and almost like disembodied in a
so
way.
I think it's interesting because if you look at this word for enlightenment, right? So in Sanskrit and in the East, we have this concept of enlightenment, and the word for that is moksha. And if we look at moksha gets translated as a lot of different things. So enlightenment is one, liberation is another, peace is a third, bliss is a fourth. And so what is this quality? So I think wonder is like a really good example of, when we talk about wonder, it's a state of consciousness. So you're not necessarily thinking about something. You're not analyzing anything when you're in wonder. You can't analyze and be in wonder at the same time. You can analyze afterward. But in that moment of wonder, you're in this transcendent state of mind where you're just absorbing, right? And there are absolutely, when you talk about looking up at the stars, that's a certain kind of wonder that sort of dissolves the sense of self and you're just like soaking it in. So for me, it's like walking on the beach during a sunset and you just lose yourself a sense of self and you're just there. You have no thoughts. You're just absorbed in the experience, which is one step towards moksha. So I don't find it surprising at all that this guy is like, okay, like awe and wonder are going to reduce inflammation and make you mentally healthier. Yeah, because it's all on the same track of transcending the body and mind.
Yeah.
And that's what's
beautifully really said.
Yeah, healthy. It's just any transcendence is good stuff.
I feel like I when I'm in the gym working out, I feel like I've lost the ego for a moment. Like I feel I guess it's like a flow state for me when I'm working out, which is not typically an activity that you would associate with feeling awe and wonder. But I feel like I do kind of get there when I'm in the gym.
So beautifully said. So it's not something that people associate with awe and wonder, but things like runner's high or exercise are very commonly induce like these no mind or flow states.
Whoa.
Right. So if you look at like traditions of Himalayan monks, trekking and hiking are very important parts of their spiritual practice.
Whoa.
So they'll go hiking in the Himalayas for like days on end. And part of that is to induce that kind of state. So there's a couple of really interesting scientific things. We know that inducing a state of transcendence requires weird things to your CO2 and O2 levels. So like a lot of these things like holotropic breath work or Wim Hof breathing or things like that, they're all about altering your physical chemistry so that you attain a certain state of mind. But exercise is absolutely something that you can lose yourself in. And a lot of people will describe that. That's part of what makes it so healing. It's not just the physical stuff and the heart rate and the blood pressure, the calories burned. It's also the mental release that you get when you exercise. And you're also spot on in terms of this flow state, that the key thing here is that there's a transcendent state, but there are many ways to get there. The key healing thing is the state of mind that you achieve, whether you do it through exercise or psychedelics or awe and wonder and looking up at the night sky with low light pollution or sitting with a formal meditation practice. Each of those will have different physiologic effects, but the key thing is the more time you spend in that state, that's what seems to be the common denominator.
Wow. So interesting. Are you interested and is there anything that you might be able to share with us about supplementation, like different nutraceuticals as they might pertain to better mental health? I mean, like a lot of people talk about theanine, which is like this amazing amino acid found in green tea that some people take for anxiety. Is there anything you can share or elaborate on with that regard?
Yeah. So I think supplements should be used with caution. And here's the reason why. So the first thing to understand is that supplements are helpful if the more unhealthy we are, the more supplements help. Does that kind of make sense? So if we have like a balanced diet and we're exercising, we're getting enough sun exposure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we don't need supplements. So supplements are helpful because our life is unhealthy. Now, some people will try to brain hack or biohack or whatever. And I think that, there's some arguments that, taking fish oil and stuff like that can be helpful. There's some really solid evidence-based kinds of things. But what I really notice is that there's almost like this psychological need to like be better, right? And people will take a lot of supplements because they want to be healthier. And there's absolutely like some room for that. But I think that a lot of this stuff should be done, I think is healthier if you do it a little bit more endogenously. Although if you don't have the luxury, by all means, take supplements. So if we're sitting in front of a computer all the time and our vitamin D levels are low, you should absolutely supplement vitamin D. Right. So fish oil is also super healthy. There's a lot of new stuff, which I think a lot of people will find some benefit from. But the thing to understand about a lot of these supplements is that they're population based. So if I give 10,000 people theanine, we may see a 20% improvement in anxiety. But it's not that 10,000 people are improving anxiety by 20%. It's probably that 30% of people are really getting helped a lot by the theanine. A solid chunk are getting helped maybe a tiny amount, and a solid chunk are not getting helped at all. And this is what you see in clinical practice as opposed to basic science research, is you can see a 20% effect size. But even when we're talking about like anti-anxiety or antidepressant medication, it doesn't do 30% for everybody. It helps a small portion a ton, helps a chunk of people maybe mild to moderate, and for a third of people doesn't help at all. So there's subdivisions that I think we need to be careful about our interpretation of the supplement literature. And that's why I really like kind of Eastern conceptions of mental health, which assume from the get-go that not everyone is the same. So supplementation in a perfect world should be very individualized. And I don't just mean lab test. I mean that depending on your, for example, like your specific constitution, your gut bacteria may be deficient in a particular neurotransmitter. So this person would benefit from this supplementation more than someone else who has a different kind of gut microbiome. So I think there's a ton of specificity with it.
Aren't there in Ayurvedic medicine, hasn't there been like, isn't ashwagandha, which, some people refer to as an adaptogen, hasn't that been used for, to help defeat anxiety for centuries at this point?
Absolutely. But I think their conception of it is kind of different. So ashwagandha has been used in the Ayurvedic tradition for thousands of years. There is decent science that ashwagandha really helps, but their whole principle of diagnosis and utilization of herbs is different from ours. So they don't think this person has anxiety, give them this herb. What they think of is that you are out of balance in this way. So you have a vata imbalance, which means that your nerves are hyperactive, your mind is prone to anxiety, you're constipated, you have eczema. There's all kinds of different things. And they'll say ashwagandha, along with these things, will bring that back into balance. And it's my belief that a lot of the mechanism through which these Ayurvedic herbs and diet, so diet is also just as effective as herbs in Ayurveda, they're even more effective. And for a long time, we were missing that link. And I think the key thing is gut microbiome, because they prescribe a certain kind of diet. And my guess is what they're doing is altering your gut microbiome so that you're selecting for example, serotonergic bacteria. And we know that in patients who have low levels of depression, they have a couple of bacteria that are very low. And with high levels of depression, they have a different bacteria that are very high. And so you have pro-depression bacteria and you have anti-depression bacteria. And that probably has something to do with like the neurotransmitter precursors that they make.
It's so interesting. We've had Karan Krishnan on the show a number of times at this point. He's a microbiome expert and talks all about how gut bacteria are involved in the metabolism of stress hormones like cortisol, in the gut, which is just mind blowing.
Absolutely. I mean, it's crazy, but the highest concentration of serotonin, everyone's concerned about serotonin in the brain. The highest concentration of serotonin is in the gut. And so gut bacteria, I think, are a huge part. We need to start thinking about them as part of us. So they're part of the cellular machinery. And just like we have deficiencies, like if I have, if my beta cells in my pancreas are shot, That means I can't produce insulin. We need to start thinking about gut bacteria as part of the fundamental like building blocks of our physiologic machinery.
So crazy. And there was that like groundbreaking review published a year ago, 2 years ago, that found that levels of serotonin in the brains of depressed patients aren't even that different. Like this whole like chemical imbalance theory of depression has essentially been debunked at this point.
Yeah, so I think that's the work of like Mark Horowitz is a big part of. I think he's one of the co-authors on that paper, and I think molecular psychiatry, and it's really interesting because even if you talk to psychiatrists, I don't know how many of them really bought into the serotonin deficiency aspect, because we don't measure serotonin levels in the brain. Like that's crazy. You can't do that. You'd have to like biopsy someone. So what we do know is that from an empiric standpoint, boosting serotonin transmission in the brain appears to help depression. So there's a big difference between, and then we sort of reverse engineered, okay, so if we increase the signal, that means it must be deficient, but that's not even the case. So you can just boost the signal, it may not be deficient to begin with. And there's even some argument that I think we're starting to see more and more data that antidepressant medication is not nearly as effective as we thought it was. So really only, if you look at the benefit of an antidepressant medication, 70% of it is what we call non-pharmacologic. So what that sort of means is like 70% of the bump that you get could be placebo.
Wow.
And really only 30% of it appears to be pharmacologic in nature. And even if you look at the people who say that, okay, even if you say that serotonin or SSRIs will help depression, they'll say that the reason that they do so is because boosting serotonin leads to overall numbness.
Oof.
So, and the reason that you feel better is because you're numbing the negative feelings.
Mm.
You're not actually fixing anything.
Yeah, no thanks. Wild. Crazy times. Well, this was super fun. I feel like I would love to have you back and do a deep dive into Ayurvedic medicine. I think it's super, super cool. And we've never really covered it in any great detail on the show in the past. So if you'd be willing, I'd love to do a deep dive at some point in the future.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, so I really like Ayurveda, but I'm not an Ayurvedic professional by any means. I incorporate principles into my practice, which I found to be very helpful. Like, so for example, patients who adhere to Ayurvedic diet, it's way easier for me to come down on their medications or even stop medications. But I think it's like a wonderful topic to discuss and explore. And there's a lot of exciting research there. So that sounds awesome.
I mean, an Ayurvedic diet, if I had to guess, probably a whole foods diet, probably a lot different than the standard American diet. Absolutely.
So I think that there's a lot of gain, not from the specificity of Ayurveda, but generally speaking, it's going to be high in fiber, high in vegetables and like all kinds of nutritious things.
Yeah.
So it's very nutritious.
Yeah. Love that. Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.